to your training.
Cool.
I don't know why it's losing it. I've been able to type.
My mouse might randomly stop working, so if I throw it over the banister, then you know why.
Good spot to tell me there.
Okay, so I'm just doing a little brief introduction to CSS and UE best practices. It's all going to be fairly high level stuff, so really basic, really sort of brief, just to get you feet wet, toes wet. So CSS, I think most of us know what CSS is. For the ones of us that don't, it's just cascading style sheets, and it's the language used to create the presentation and styling of web pages and websites. So it's used to control the style of, but not limited to, typography, fonts, colour schemes, layouts, and all that sort of things. It is easy, sort of. I say sort of because it's easy to pick up in terms of font dash size is going to give you the specific font size for that web page. But the little quirks of CSS are not easy to pick up, and you only really pick them up with experience. So making a fluid CSS responsive layout, things like that, making it browser compatible, are things you only pick up through using it. So CSS as a language is easy to learn, but it's hard to pick up the quirks. It is getting much better with the advent of CSS3. CSS has probably been a bit of the ugly duckling of the web development world. Really basic sort of functionality, but it is getting better. Stuff of responsive web design and the media queries, so it works down to small tablet devices and mobile phones, and it's got certain breakpoints, animations, and powerful new CSS selectors, which allow us to target, just give us more power over the elements that we're targeting on a page. So there's some CSS best practices. Please refrain from inline styles. It's a big one. It's a real big plus. Like the separation of concerns we have with VB code and markup, it's just as important that we have a separation of concerns for CSS styling and markup. Just makes everything easier to maintain, just a whole lot simpler.
So that's, what you mean by that is the HTML then?
Yeah, the CSS is separate from the HTML markup.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very important that you maintain those separations of concerns for maintainability.
Yeah.
Use relative units over absolute units for font and layout sizing. So rems, this is the new one, but ems and percentage over pixel-based units. So if a user is using, say, 18 pixel font size for their default browser, it's not going to destroy your layout, because we're using ems and percentages rather than pixels. Pixels are very rigid and they're absolute units. So it's much easier to scale up when you're using ems and percentages. Don't use HTML tables for the main structure layout of the website. There really is no excuse to be doing that anymore. HTML tables are for tabular data only. The days of where we were using them for the structure of the main website are long gone. There is really no excuse not to be using fluid divs and things like that. And there's even tools that will do it for you to a certain extent. And no more hacks. So we used to have to do things like IE-specific hacks to get things to work properly and display properly in IE. They're a thing of the past, and that's where they should be staying as well. Center elements the right way and the easy way. So I see often people trying to hack together margins between, they want a section completely centered in the middle of a page, and they might have done a 50 pixel margin there and a 49 pixel margin there. The simplest way to do it is to do margin 0 auto, and as long as that element is less than 100%, so say 50%, it will be centered perfectly on the page for you automatically without you having to do any complicated maths. User preprocessor, and these last two might be cause a bit of a debate, but there we go. But user preprocessor and SAS basically. The only reason less is still around is because of Bootstrap mainly. And the big plus of SAS is that it has proper conditional logic. and that's the biggest win for me. That wins hands down for me. And then the second point is forget XHTML valid documents. This was a massive fad that I jumped on the bandwagon back in the day, and I'm really guilty of this as well. We'd have to conform to XHTML valid documents, just so we can put a shiny button on the bottom of our website to say, "Ooh, our website's valid XHTML." Doesn't matter. It really does, as long as your website works cross-browser compatible, there isn't any bugs, and it renders how you want it to, we shouldn't be worrying about this. Validity tools on W3 are good for putting your document through and say you may have missed a closing div tag or a closing p tag or a closing tag element. They're good for catching that sort of thing. But the valid documents, it doesn't matter. As long as your website displays properly in all browsers, it doesn't matter. There is a lot more best practices as well. So things like commenting your code, using shorthand notation. So like this as well. You've got, for your margins, you've got a top margin, a right margin, a bottom margin, and a left margin. This is shorthand. So this will do top and bottom is 0, auto, left and right. Things like that. Really, really simple thing. Grouping selectors as well, which I'm starting to do in vScreen. So common styles that we're using over and over again, just group it. Just group it on the selectors. And some resources for CSS if you're ever going to be getting into it, or if you're ever going to be wondering. I don't know if any of you have ever came across caniuse.com.
Yep.
Really good resource for finding out what the new CSS selectors and old CSS selectors browsers are supported in. Not just CSS, you've got JavaScript in there, and you've got HTML as well. CSS Tricks is a big resource that I use. Chris Coyer, massive CSS guru. Always blogging about it, always coming up with loads of tips and tricks to get you moving forward. And obviously, developer and Mozilla. Next, going to just give you a brief overview of UI design best practices. The first thing to note is that this first one, assumptions not requirements, most of the time. I have to stress most of the time, and I have to stress that UI assumptions are different from UI functionality. So, because a customer is asking for a button to be here, is an assumption. It doesn't necessarily mean the button should be there. That's just an assumption. They're not a requirement until that's proven with a UCD process, a user-centered design process, which basically allows us to get the users involved in the design stages and test and give us feedback. Really, really essential that happens, because at the end of the day, it's not for a customer to decide that a button should go there or a button should go there. It's what's going to be most usable. Functionality, yes, customers will request functionality, but UI assumptions, things like buttons and stuff like that, they're really just assumptions until proven correct. I've got a short video here which he does probably a lot better job than me of explaining the whole user-centered design process. It's only a couple of minutes long, so I'll play that to you now.
You're listening to Do the Internet Better. One take, 5 minutes, live in the square. Hi, my name's Will. I'm hoping that today I'll be able to talk about
Just turn it up first.
user interface and user experience design, using a method that we call the user is drunk. But to talk about interfaces, we first have to ask, what is an interface? People say it's a keyboard, or it's a bunch of buttons on a screen. Realistically, an interface is where two things meet. It's the interface in language between accountancy and law. It could be the interface between air and water. Surface tension is an interface. And when you realize that interfaces are real things, you start to realize that a lot of the stuff on the web is just echoes of real life. For instance, a door that has a round handle is much harder to turn than a door that has a lever handle. A door that opens for you automatically is like a login form that remembers who you are. A twist top bottle is a lot easier to open than a bottle that requires a bottle opener. You've seen tabs, breadcrumbs, and even radio buttons that are all real-like things that we've transferred into the internet. One of the beautiful things about great UI is that it's not there. It's like lovers who talk without talking. It's like a guitar player who just lets the music come out and they're not really sure if the guitar's there anymore. If you can make your user interfaces porous so that people don't realize they're there, they will use them much more effectively. For example, the amount of embarrassing things that are said on Facebook through Facebook chat is because people can use them while they're actually blind drunk. It's because the UI is that good. So let's look at what makes a drunk a drunk. They've got blurry vision, which means that you should be able to understand what a site is doing when it's blurry as when it's not. Guess what the big blue button does? It does the thing the site's there for. They're really attention poor. It's like, I'm going to go Savlaki, then we're going to go dancing, then we're going to go drinking. How do you deal with that? You guide them through the process. It's kind of like, okay, put on your shoes, now we're going to get into the taxi, now we're going to go to the club, or, okay, you've bought your ticket, now you need to download your ticket, now you need to, etc., etc. Guide them through a process as though they're blind drunk, and you'll actually get a real approximation of what an average user is like. If in any doubt, say it twice. You are about to delete an item. Congratulations, you have deleted the item. Say it twice. A really good example of this is speed signs. In all Australian law, in all of our roads, there's a 60k speed sign, and then like another couple of hundred meters later, there's another 60k speed sign. It's because you don't realize it the first time, but you see it twice, and you go, oh, okay, and then you slow down again. So say everything twice, confirmation dialogues, even just a little effect that proves that they've actually done something. Emotion really, really matters. Drunk people go from best friends to fisticuffs in seconds. On the web, it's even worse, because people will go from annoyed at your site to closing it with a click of a button. A great way around this is over-the-shoulder testing. Put somebody on a laptop in a real room and ask them to do some stuff. Please log in. Please download the form. Do whatever it is. And just watch them. And you'll see the drunken master arise. They'll start to click on things frantically. Their brow will furrow and they'll get really, really emotional. And that's where you see the problems. One important thing about the drunk is that he is not an idiot. A person with an IQ of 160 who's drunk still has an IQ of 160. They just get more pedantic and more annoyed. So don't talk down to them. Don't be overly simplistic in what you do. And if they're a power user, let them be a power user. Because realistically, the user is not actually drunk. The user is fine. But with the amount of attention, after dealing with Bob with accounts, Jennifer in HR, who I really want to sleep with, the kids, the wife, the family, soccer, my gun practice in the afternoon, the amount of time left to pay attention to your UI, which you love, and I could not give a shit about, is nothing. Nothing at all. So, should you test this? Should you go home, drink a martini, and go through your application? Definitely not. It's really, really unconstructive.
So yeah, there's a really good way of explaining it, really.
Or I get ready to catch it as it throws.
Christopher
Like
Hitchens.
you just as you've said about
It's a bit strange to see Christopher Hitchens turn up.
So yeah.
So yeah, coming back to this user-centered design point, a really good example of this was a couple of weeks ago when Hypertherm came to us and said that the zoom button on the activity image wasn't working for them for whatever reason. They couldn't see it, or it was obstructing some sort of flag on the image. So that's feedback, that's testing, that's them giving us an input, and then us going, okay, now let's make an amendment, or let's make an iteration of this and change it and move forward. Make well-informed assumptions about the UI. That's something we can do. So if we have limited or no information or feedback from real users, draw on existing UI knowledge and best practices. That's really important. So if we don't have any user feedback, we use best practices. Now, what are best practices? People like Donald Norman, Jacob Nielsen, and Ben Schneiderman are three big pioneers in usability and usability specialists. And they produced a list of usability principles that we can not only test against, but design for as well. So you can come into an application and you can test against these design principles that I'll show you in a minute, and we can test the usability of the system against these principles. And we can also use them at the very beginning of a project and design for these principles to give us a high level of usability in the application. So yeah, some of these are really, really obvious, some of them are not. You may have heard me talk about affordance before. It's not pricing, as some people seem to think it is. It's offering the user visual clues. So a button affords to be pressed. You know, a mouse button is clickable, things like that. A link is, when you hover over it, you click it. It's making things obvious, giving them visual clues. Mapping. So you all have cookers and ovens at home. The way that the dials and the knobs are mapped on your ovens and cookers, they're all mapped in terms of, and consistently in terms of how they're used and their function, and the directional buttons on your keyboard as well. Visibility, the user needs to know the system status. So if something's broken or whatever, they're quite logical things. Feedback really speaks for itself. Same with consistency and the idea of constraints. The idea of being safe in an application, so a user should be prevented from breaking things, losing data, and things like that. So they're the sort of principles that we look to design for when we're beginning a project, and then test against when we're dealing with an existing application. This gives us a real sort of higher level of usability if we use resources like this. So yeah, some more best practices and including points. I touched on it earlier, and it comes back to typography and font colours and stuff like that. Again, you can tie that in with CSS and stuff, but it's very early. It's very important to focus on typography and colour and structure early in the development stages, because if you've got fluid fonts, fluid design, it just goes all the way, it inherits all the way through the development stage. The UCD process is invaluable, it really is. Involving users from the start of a project, or even bringing them in halfway through a project, you will see immense differences in the level of usability that you can attain. Draw on existing UI knowledge and best practices. So the key pioneers of Jacob Nelson, who said that we can get away with testing 5 users and still attain 75% of usability problems with just 5 users. You know, principles and ideas like that are really good to draw on and to use and to incorporate in a development project. Again, assumptions are just assumptions until proven correct. So until the feedback is there, until it's been tested, they're just assumptions. UE assumptions are just assumptions. They can always be subject to change. This is a real pet hate. Some people might think it's pedantic, but this is a real pet hate, and we actually got marked down at university for using the wrong term. A lot of people say user-friendly, but it's usable. An application or a piece of software can't make friends with you. It might seem pedantic, but seriously, it goes a long way. It's either the application is either usable or it's not usable. It's not user-friendly. So that would be good to move away from terms like that. Really important to keep track of current UI trends and patterns. So I don't know if I touched on it earlier, but you go on the web and everything is conforming to the same sort of style, the same sort of standard. A login form has your 2 fields and your submit button, but you forget password. You know, the navigation process is pretty much consistent on every single website. Maybe styled differently, but the process is the same. It's really, really important to keep track of those sort of trends on the web. And incorporate the use of a framework, such as a packed framework, when designing these UI interfaces. So packed is the people that are going to be using the application, what activities they're going to undertake, in what context, and what technologies they're going to use. And that allows us to brainstorm all of those individual pieces and get a better idea of how people are going to use this application, move forward, and things like that. Any questions?
No? How does Phil's PowerPoint idea conform to current trends?
Not very well.
So this is
I agree.
dated, is that what you're saying?
Well, Phil, PowerPoint's a PowerPoint. It's just
PowerPoint is a list of memory joggers. That's all it is.
a PowerPoint.
Implementing in the web is what's a little
Yeah,
unusual.
a PowerPoint is just there just for demonstration purposes. It's not massively important. It's not like a website, but it is quite important, and Phil was saying to me earlier that this is a bit dated and needs to be revisited and looked at, but yeah, things like that, definitely.
This is actually very relevant to us in the training material, very relevant. And we did start off with establishing initial design styles and the typography and everything, colours. The only thing we haven't got is we haven't had a lot of feedback from the customers who've actually been using the training material.
Well, I mean, yeah,
I think that would be valuable.
definitely.
And what I've done there as well is actually using best practice, looking at the local changes, the relevant changes to interactions,
How do you
make feedback is what are people doing out there now to make it more relevant. So there are different subtle changes which have happened.
But again, I think we are making the assumptions on behalf of the customers because of the lack of feedback that we've had.
So I'm
it's
dealing
not
with
through lack
V-screen.
of
So I'm dealing with V-screen, and often it's some of the things that are in there at the moment are just based on assumptions, and we're not going to know how well they work until they're tested.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's important to remember that as well. And where we don't have the information at hand, or we don't have the feedback or knowledge, we should use UE best practices and previous knowledge. We shouldn't just guess. There are things in place, there are principles in place where, you know, that's a login form, or that's a navigation, or etc., etc. And users will be more familiar with that because they go on the internet, or they may go on the internet and use the same things every day.
Absolutely.
You know, the over-the-shoulder thing that you mentioned earlier, that would be useful to implement as an entire office on things, not just training, but maybe other things as well.
Well, this is something I've got to speak to Phil about, because user testing and seeing a user in context and using the system is really valuable, especially for something that I'm doing.
They tend to use me as a guinea pig, so I don't know anything about how you program the actual software. And a lot of the software I only pick up how you use it by listening in. So I use David's lessons to teach me how to use the software. So if I don't get out of David's lesson, because I do it in tandem with the software, if I don't understand still how to use the software using David's lesson, then no disrespect, but I say David's lesson's failed because he hasn't taught me how to use it properly. And the description that you had about someone sitting and trying to go through, for example, if I'm going through a lesson and it's not working, David knows I sit there in the afternoon and I get more and more frustrated because I don't know what I'm doing and it's not teaching me what I need to
And
know.
for me to be able to see that in a manufacturing environment, people using vScreen and what's not working properly is just
Yeah, so David uses me as a guinea pig in that respect.
And again, that's how I learn the software.
Absolutely.
there really is no substitute for that sort of testing, because you find out things that you may not have found out.
Yeah. But it is very valuable. So this, I didn't think this was going to be relevant.
Exactly,
It was
it's very, very valuable.
Absolutely is.
Use Mario as a good. Next week we go to the training.
Yeah,
Maybe going through the first one.
and good to get his feedback as well.
Anything else?
That's fine, thanks mate. Well done.
That was excellent.
No, very good.
No.
Cool.
Yeah, if you want to put a list of those links and